Hello everyone, Professor Philip Travis. And this week in U.S. history, we are going to be talking about what was a really significant turning point in American history, 1968. Now, we're not going to be just limited only to the year 1968. We're going to be looking at developments in previous years. The images that you see here, this image right here particularly is from 1967. We're also going to be considering developments in the years immediately following 1968 under the presidency of Richard Nixon. But 1968 really goes down in American history as a very significant turning point. And it's a turning point in American society as well as in the Vietnam War. So 1968 is a turning point for the U.S. war in Vietnam. It is the moment where the United States really begins to begin a path of withdrawal from directly fighting the war in and around South Vietnam. But it's also a political turning point in the United States. It is a moment in time that witnesses the fracturing of the old liberal coalition in the United States. In the period of the 1960s in the United States and across Europe, there was a new sort of liberal movement, sometimes referred to as the New Left. And in the United States, the New Left very much broke from sort of the old New Deal liberal coalition that was really embodied by political figures like Lyndon Johnson. And the New Left's positions, we're going to listen to Martin Luther King Jr. speak on his opposition to the Vietnam War in 1967. And I think Martin Luther King's statements very much sort of embody some of the sentiments of the New Left at the time, which really challenged the United States, particularly on its role in Vietnam. So as the liberal coalition fractured, though, the chaos surrounding the Vietnam War, the chaos that sometimes ensued in the United States, most vividly probably the police riot, as it's sometimes called, at the Democratic Convention of 1968, as well as other phenomenons that made some Americans uncomfortable that were associated with the counterculture movement. That, of course, was happening under the backdrop of opposition to the Vietnam War, oftentimes. 1968 witnesses a sort of coalescence of the modern conservative movement. So as the New Deal liberal coalition fractures, as it fights over its war in Vietnam, the conservative thinkers in the United States, both libertarians as well as religious conservatives in the United States, begin to compromise and coalesce around certain core principles. The idea of law and order, as Nixon would convey in his presidential campaign bid of 1968. Of course, you don't see the full triumph, if you will, of the modern conservative paradigm until the election of Ronald Reagan. But you see it developing in the 1960s. First, with the candidacy of Barry Goldwater in 1964, Barry Goldwater from Arizona, and then, of course, the presidency of Richard Nixon, who ran his candidacy largely, again, on the idea of bringing law and order to the United States, of ending the war in Vietnam, but doing so in a way that would achieve what he called peace with honor, which actually involved withdrawing American troops while simultaneously escalating the war in certain areas, including the invasion of Cambodia, a South Vietnamese American-directed invasion of Laos, both of which were failures, and a more intensive and less regulated bombing campaign than had been conducted by Lyndon Johnson. Of course, all of that ended with the same sort of consequence. South Vietnam in 1975 would, of course, collapse 2 years after the United States' exit following the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. So 1968 is really a turning point. So let's talk about these images for a second here. So as Vietnam began to really deteriorate into a very brutal conflict, a conflict that saw 10 to 15,000 soldiers dying each year at the height of the conflict. It resulted in widespread protest, and protest often centered on issues like the usage of napalm, for example, jellied gasoline, which became associated with horrifying maiming of individuals, particularly civilian individuals, when attacks on guerrillas were close to villages, and napalm attacks missed their targets and so forth. It was also centered around the draft. And this photo right here is from 1967. This is the large October Stop the Draft Week protest, as the draft conscription into this conflict became increasingly unpopular. As the United States under Lyndon Johnson faced a great deal of political pressure, the war was still, it was becoming more unpopular. It wasn't massively unpopular, but it wasn't popular either in 1967. But as more people started protesting, increasingly Johnson's popularity was falling. And the popularity of the war itself was beginning to fall a little bit too. And so the Johnson administration in 1967 basically went out on a campaign with William Westmoreland, the general from South Vietnam, other individuals from the Department of Defense, and they went out on this sort of communication campaign. And this was all centered around the idea of explaining to Americans that we need to just, take it easy because the war is about ready to be over. So the sort of PR campaign, the public relations campaign that the Johnson administration would unfold in the fall of 1967 was really designed to tell Americans that victory is at hand, that effectively success in the Vietnam War is just around the corner, and Americans just have to be patient. Well, in December and January 1st, the siege at Khe Sanh began, and then at the end of January 1968, during the Lunar New Year, the Tet Offensive was launched, and this shocked the American people. These two images are from the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was, from a military standpoint, it should be noted, the Tet Offensive was a military failure. The Viet Cong guerrillas that were directed by North Vietnam were ultimately destroyed in this, and actually really never regained this type of operational capabilities. The Viet Cong were the sort of guerrillas that were embedded in South Vietnam during the war. Tet was designed to begin what they thought would be a general uprising. The guerrillas launched attacks all across, as did the North Vietnamese army, but particularly guerrillas all across South Vietnam. It was an unprecedented offensive. No one thought this could happen before the PR campaign of 1967, and even fewer people thought it could happen prior to that fall public relations campaign that the Johnson administration went on in 1967. And the United States actually, military planners in South Vietnam actually overlooked some really important documents that suggested that this was going to happen. When Tet happens, and again, the height of the Tet Offensive lasts about a month and a half, but it shocked the American people. And there were some really, really just horrifying and intense imagery that came through through the news. The ancient imperial city of Hue was sieged as American forces and their allies, South Vietnamese allies, sought to retake the city, which had been occupied by the Vietnamese communists. Hue became a 3-week brutal battle, a destructive battle. It was all over the news for weeks. In Saigon, the U.S. embassy was attacked, and there was news footage of American embassy personnel wearing suits and ties engaged in battles over the embassy. Now, the embassy was, the actual attackers never got into the heart of the embassy. They got in the primary courtyard around the embassy, but the embassy was attacked. You even had images like this image here, where a U.S. ally, a South Vietnamese colonel, had his home attacked, and the Viet Cong guerrilla pictured here was dragged out in the street where he was summarily executed. in the street. And this was all captured on footage. Americans see these happening. This is the ruin of the Sholan district, the Chinese district of Saigon, in complete rubble. And as all this is happening, this crisis amongst the people, the attack on the American embassy, the siege at Khe Sanh in the north near Laos and North Vietnam, near the border, the demilitarized zone, the 17th parallel, as these things are being brought home to Americans, Americans start to really question whether or not the United States was winning the war. And even Walter Cronkite, the famed journalist, one of the rare times that he gave an opinion, even himself suggested that it did not appear that Americans, maybe we weren't losing the war, but it was hard for Americans to suggest they were winning the war. As Ted unfolded, Lyndon Johnson, his new Secretary of Defense was Clark Clifford, and before him was Robert McNamara, of course. Well, Robert McNamara had been basically dismissed because in 1967, Robert McNamara, who was the architect of the bombing campaign, it's called the Interdiction Campaign, McNamara said, hey, this is not working, and he suggested that the United States should begin peace negotiations and should begin to halt the bombing operations. Johnson believed he was being disloyal. McNamara was out. Clark Clifford was in. And now at this point, Clark Clifford begins to tell Johnson the same thing. That this is not... Clark Clifford has a story where he went to talk to the Defense Department over this, and they're talking about the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What's the strategy to win in Vietnam? And Clark Clifford was shocked that even at this point, there was really no strategy offered to win except to send more troops there. And there was a request for another 206,000 troops. Would have taken American troop levels close to 700,000 at the time. Clark Clifford, the Secretary of Defense, he, in a quote, says, this is a real loser, meaning we shouldn't be involved here, we should begin negotiations, we should stop the bombing, these types of things. Basically the position McNamara had before. Conveys this to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was just kind of beside himself over the situation. He's kind of locked. He felt was trapped in the situation. And at the end of March 1968, Johnson made a really stunning announcement. He went on television and he told the American people that he would not run, and he would not accept the nomination for another term as president. He wasn't resigning. His term would be up that year. It was a presidential election year, but he would not run again. And that he was going to focus on the task at hand, and he would then begin to pursue peace negotiations and pursue a bombing halt during that period. Now, that leads up to the nomination for the Democratic candidate for president. One of the most hopeful was Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy's tragically assassinated in 1968. In April of that year, Bobby Kennedy died in June of 1968. In April 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated as well in Memphis, Tennessee. And Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, becomes the presidential nominee. Well, as this is all happening, Nixon's around the country and he's campaigning and he's saying we need law and order, we need to find peace with honor in Vietnam. He's in an advantageous position because all of the sort of microscope of criticism is on the Democratic leadership. And at the Democratic convention in 1968, where Humphrey would be nominated in a very contentious nomination, there was what historians call a police riot outside of the convention, where the Chicago Mayor Daley, said no protesters should be allowed to get anywhere near the convention center. And what happens when protesters approach the convention center is scenes like this. A police riot ensues. Again, this is all over the news in the United States. And this creates a real a high-level controversy in the United States. It helps to lend to the election of Richard Nixon, who, again, was running on the sort of law and order candidacy. And what you see happening with the election of Nixon is, again, situations like this. Hubert Humphrey is a Democrat. Hubert Humphrey is a New Deal liberal Democrat, right? He's the old liberal coalition. They got stuck in Vietnam, but that's not really what they're about, right? They're about New Deal types of social programs, but they are now responsible for what's happening in Vietnam. And they're dividing the new left and the old New Deal liberal coalition are dividing. They're separating. They're the focal point here. And as this is all happening, Americans increasingly begin to move towards the camp of Richard Nixon on the idea of sort of, they came together on a number of issues. So and watch my lecture for this week. I'll talk about this, but the conservative movement coalesces at the very time that the old liberal coalition is fracturing. And that becomes a really significant turning point. So this is a turning point, not only for the war in Vietnam, it's also a turning point for the political direction of the future, because what you're seeing really happening here is you're seeing the roots begin to be established of the emergence of what becomes kind of known as the modern conservative paradigm, which is the political paradigm that is dominant in the United States today and has been dominant in the United States since the election of Ronald Reagan, his inauguration in 1981, the modern conservative movement. And we're going to be talking more about the modern conservative movement in American society in weeks ahead. So this week, I'll give you a couple points, long as usual. Sorry. Hopefully you don't mind that these go a little bit long, but history's complicated. Historians like to write books. We're a little bit long-winded at times. But I hope this is clear, and I'll give everyone 2 points for this week. Please just kind of summarize what you think are some of the key features from this announcement, and let's have a great week. I'll see everyone in the discussion forum. We also have a quiz activity this week that I think you'll enjoy. It involves a speech by MLK as well as some music from the era. So if you're not in my class, or if you are in my class, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, History Changes. But otherwise, I'll see everyone in the class this week. Let's have a great week, everyone.